Something happened last night that you were never supposed to understand at first glance. There was a conversation, a moment of silence, a look that lasted longer than it should have, and somewhere in the middle of it all, your soulmate was forced to confront a feeling they had been trying to avoid. They may have been physically present with someone else, but emotionally, their mind kept returning to you. And what happened next may completely change the way you understand their silence. Before you allow your imagination to create the worst possible story, pause for a moment. Do not rush to conclusions. Do not assume that being around another person automatically means betrayal, romance, or the end of something meaningful. Sometimes circumstances look completely different from what they really are. Sometimes one evening reveals more about a person's heart than months of ordinary conversations ever could. Last night carried a strange emotional weight. Your soulmate may have entered that situation expecting nothing more than an ordinary evening. Perhaps they thought they could distract themselves. Perhaps they believed they could laugh, talk, socialize, or simply keep their mind occupied. Maybe they even told themselves that they were finally moving forward and leaving old emotions behind, but then something happened. Your presence entered their thoughts without you physically being there. It could have been something small. A song. A familiar phrase. A place. A certain expression on someone's face. A conversation about relationships. A question they weren't prepared to answer. Maybe someone mentioned commitment, memories, the future, or the person who still occupies a hidden corner of their heart, and suddenly, the room felt different, because no matter who was sitting beside them, their mind began traveling somewhere else. It traveled to you. They may have tried to hide it. They may have smiled and continued the conversation. They may have looked perfectly normal from the outside. But inside, something shifted. A realization began forming that they could no longer easily dismiss. They realized that there are certain people you can be around while still feeling emotionally distant, and there are other people you can be physically separated from while feeling incredibly close. You may be that person for them. This does not mean you should assume every detail of their life or treat a spiritual message as proof of something you cannot personally verify. Think of this message as a reflective, fictional soulmate-style narration, a reminder to slow down, trust what you can actually observe, and allow emotions to unfold without forcing them, because last night may represent something deeper than jealousy. It may represent realization. There are moments when someone finally understands what they have been avoiding. They can spend weeks, months, or even years telling themselves that they are unaffected. They can convince themselves that they have moved on. They can surround themselves with noise, people, entertainment, responsibilities, and distractions, but eventually, silence catches up with them, and last night, silence may have found your soulmate. Imagine them sitting somewhere surrounded by conversation. Everyone is talking. Someone is laughing. Music may be playing in the background. Phones are lighting up. People are sharing stories, yet your soulmate suddenly becomes quiet. Nobody understands why. Someone might ask, "Are you okay?" And they might answer, "Yeah, I'm fine." But those two words may not tell the whole story. Because inside, they are remembering something. They are remembering your voice. They are remembering the way you looked at them. They are remembering a conversation that seemed ordinary at the time but now feels strangely important. They are remembering something they never properly explained. They are remembering the moment they realized they cared more deeply than they wanted to admit. And perhaps the most surprising part is that they may have realized they were comparing what they were experiencing in that moment with what they once experienced with you, not because anyone else was necessarily doing anything wrong, not because the other person was necessarily a romantic interest, but because your soulmate discovered that emotional connection cannot simply be replaced because someone new walks into a room. There is a difference between attention and connection. There is a difference between companionship and understanding. There is a difference between being surrounded by people and feeling truly seen. And last night may have reminded them of that difference. Perhaps someone tried to get closer to them emotionally. Perhaps a conversation became personal. Maybe they were asked what they really wanted from a relationship. That question may have caught them off guard. What do you actually want? A simple question. Yet sometimes simple questions are the hardest to answer. Because your soulmate may have realized that their honest answer could not be separated from the memory of you. They may have thought about your personality, your energy, your conversations, your imperfections, your kindness, and even the moments when the two of you misunderstood one another. They may have remembered that connection was never perfect, but it was real. And sometimes people do not appreciate something fully until they experience what its absence feels like. Maybe last night they discovered that. Maybe they laughed with someone else and suddenly remembered a joke you once made. Maybe someone looked at them with affection and they remembered how differently they felt when you looked at them. Maybe someone asked them to open up, and they realized there were certain things they had only ever felt comfortable telling you. Maybe someone asked about the person they loved most, and they avoided answering. That avoidance itself may have told them something, because when a name is truly irrelevant, sometimes it is easy to say, but when a name still carries emotional weight, even silence can become an answer. Your soulmate may have spent much of the evening trying to convince themselves that nothing was wrong, but their emotions may have disagreed, and eventually, they may have stepped away from everyone for a few minutes. Maybe they went outside. Maybe they stood near a window. Maybe they looked at their phone without knowing what they were looking for. Maybe they opened your conversation. Maybe they stared at your name. Maybe they typed something and deleted it. Maybe they wanted to reach out but stopped themselves. And that moment of hesitation matters, not as proof of what they did, but as a symbol of an internal struggle. There are people who want to say everything but do not know how to begin. There are people who miss someone but are afraid that admitting it will make them vulnerable. There are people who regret their choices but do not know whether they still deserve another opportunity. And there are people who realize too late that their pride protected them from embarrassment while also keeping them separated from the person they cared about. Perhaps your soulmate is somewhere in that emotional space. They may be asking themselves questions they avoided before. Why am I still thinking about them? Why does their absence bother me? Why do I keep remembering the little things? Why didn't I say what I really felt? Why did I pretend I didn't care? Why does everyone else feel different? Those questions can be uncomfortable, but discomfort often comes before honesty. And honesty is where change begins. Maybe the person your soulmate was with last night noticed the change. Maybe they looked at your soulmate and realized their attention was somewhere else. Perhaps they asked, "Are you thinking about someone?" And your soulmate froze, not because they had necessarily done anything wrong, but because the question landed directly on the truth they had been avoiding. They might have denied it, they might have changed the subject, they might have laughed, but inside, they knew exactly who had crossed their mind: you. And maybe that is what makes this story surprising. The important event last night may not have been about who your soulmate was physically with. It may have been about what your soulmate finally understood while they were there. Sometimes the biggest turning points happen quietly. No dramatic announcement, no public confession, no grand gesture, just one person sitting alone afterward and realizing, "I still care." That realization can change everything. But remember something important. You do not have to chase someone simply because you feel connected to them. You do not have to monitor their every movement. You do not have to interpret every coincidence as a secret sign. You do not have to put your life on hold waiting for someone else to make a decision. Your worth does not depend on whether someone chooses you quickly enough. Your peace matters too. If this story resonates with you, let it remind you that love should eventually move toward honesty, respect, communication, and mutual effort. Mystery can be exciting, but clarity is healthier. And perhaps your soulmate is beginning to understand that. Last night may have exposed something they had been hiding from themselves. They may have realized that distraction is not healing. They may have realized that pretending not to care does not erase care. They may have realized that moving forward does not mean running away from unresolved emotions. And they may have realized that if they truly want a future with someone, eventually they must stop hiding behind uncertainty. There is a moment in every emotional journey when a person becomes tired of their own excuses. Maybe last night was that moment for them. Maybe they looked around and thought about how much time had passed. Maybe they remembered opportunities they allowed to slip away. Maybe they remembered a message they never sent. Maybe they remembered a conversation they ended too quickly. Maybe they remembered the last time they saw you. And suddenly, the memory did not feel distant. It felt immediate. It felt alive. It felt unfinished. That word, unfinished, may be the most important word in this entire message, because sometimes two people do not separate because they stopped caring. Sometimes they separate because timing, fear, circumstances, pride, misunderstandings, or personal growth created distance. That does not automatically mean they are destined to reunite, but it can mean that both people still have something to learn from what happened. And perhaps your soulmate is learning right now. They may be learning that you cannot keep someone emotionally close while physically pushing them away. They may be learning that silence can create misunderstandings. They may be learning that pride can become loneliness. They may be learning that affection without communication leaves people guessing. they may be learning that if they want to be understood, they must also be willing to explain themselves. And perhaps they are learning something about you. Maybe they underestimated your impact. Maybe they thought you would always be there. Maybe they assumed time would make everything disappear, but time did something unexpected. Instead of erasing the memory, it clarified it. The distance may have allowed them to notice the things they took for granted: your patience, your presence, your ability to listen, your humor, your honesty, the way you encouraged them, the way you challenged them. Even the disagreements may now look different, because sometimes, when emotions settle, people begin to see an old relationship from a completely different perspective. They may realize that what they once considered difficult was actually an opportunity to grow. They may recognize that both of you were learning. Neither person had everything figured out. Neither person was perfect, and perhaps that is what makes the memory meaningful. It was human, it was complicated, it was imperfect, and it mattered. Last night, your soulmate may have encountered a situation that forced them to compare their present emotions with their past experiences. That comparison may have surprised them. They may have expected to feel excited. Instead, they felt thoughtful. They may have expected to feel free. Instead, they felt nostalgic. They may have expected to feel completely detached. Instead, they discovered that some feelings had never disappeared. Again, do not treat this as factual knowledge about a specific person's private life. Let it be a story that speaks to the emotional possibility of realization, while real-world truth comes from honest communication and observable actions. Because if someone truly wants to return to your life, eventually there must be more than signs. There must be action. There must be accountability. There must be respect. There must be a willingness to communicate, and perhaps that is exactly what your soulmate is beginning to consider. Maybe they are thinking about reaching out. Maybe they are considering what they would say. Maybe they are afraid you will reject them. Maybe they are wondering whether you have moved on. Maybe they are imagining your reaction. Would you be angry? Would you forgive them? Would you listen? Would you still care? Those questions may be keeping them awake, and perhaps they are beginning to understand that they cannot know the answer unless they have the courage to communicate honestly. Imagine them holding their phone. Your name appears in their thoughts. Their thumb hovers over the screen. They type a simple message, "Hey," then they stop, delete, try again, "I've been thinking about you," delete, again, "There is something I need to tell you," delete, because the truth is heavier than the message. How do you explain months of confusion in one conversation? How do you apologize for distance? How do you admit that you missed someone? How do you tell someone that you tried to move on and discovered that your feelings were still unresolved? There is no perfect sentence. There is only honesty, and maybe that is what they are searching for, the courage to be honest. Not dramatic, not manipulative, not mysterious, just honest. Perhaps they finally understand that if they want another chance, they cannot expect you to decode their silence. You deserve clarity. You deserve direct communication. You deserve someone who can say what they mean. And if your soulmate truly has experienced a realization, their next step should eventually reflect it. that is where the real story begins. Because last night may have been the internal turning point, but what happens afterward is what matters. Will they communicate? Will they take responsibility? Will they show consistency? Will they respect your boundaries? Will they stop repeating old patterns? Those are the questions worth watching, not rumors, not assumptions, not imagined scenarios, actions. Sometimes the universe of a person's inner world can change long before their outer behavior catches up. Someone can realize they love you and still need time to become emotionally mature enough to express it properly. Someone can miss you and still be afraid. Someone can regret something and still struggle to apologize. Someone can understand your value and still need to learn how to treat you with that value. That is why patience should never mean abandoning yourself. You can care about someone and continue living your own life. You can hope and still have boundaries. You can believe in love and still require respect. You can remember someone without chasing them. You can leave the door unlocked emotionally without standing beside it all night waiting. Your life continues. Your growth continues. Your story continues. And perhaps that is part of what your soulmate is beginning to notice. They may have imagined that you would remain exactly where they left you. But you are changing. You are becoming stronger. You are becoming more aware of what you deserve. You are learning to distinguish between attention and commitment. You are learning that words are beautiful, but consistency is what makes words believable, and perhaps your growth is what makes them nervous. Because they may realize that if they return, they cannot return as the same person. They cannot bring the same confusion. They cannot bring the same avoidance. They cannot expect you to accept half-hearted effort. Something has to change. Maybe last night gave them that realization. Maybe they looked at their own choices and thought, "What have I been doing?" Maybe they recognized that they were avoiding the one conversation they actually needed to have. Maybe they realized that the person they kept trying to forget was still emotionally significant. Maybe they finally understood that being surrounded by people does not automatically create connection, and maybe, for the first time, they stopped running from that truth. There may have been a quiet moment after the evening ended. The room became still, the noise disappeared, they were alone with their thoughts. And that is when memories become loud. They may have remembered your face, your voice, your laughter, your patience, the way you looked at them when they were not at their best, the moments when you believed in them, the times you tried to understand them. The things they never thanked you for, the things they never apologized for, the words they should have said. And perhaps one particular memory stayed longer than all the others. Maybe it was something tiny, a glance, a goodbye, a message. A moment when you both laughed, something that seemed meaningless then but now feels like a hidden treasure. That is how memory works. It does not always preserve the biggest moments. Sometimes it preserves the smallest ones. And perhaps last night, one of those small memories opened a door inside them. Suddenly, the past did not look like a closed chapter. It looked like a question. What if they had spoken sooner? What if they had been less afraid? What if they had trusted their feelings? What if they had listened? What if they had not allowed pride to interfere? What if they had chosen differently? questions cannot change the past, but they can change the future. And perhaps your soulmate is now asking a question even more important than all of those. What should I do now? That is where courage enters, because realizing something is easy compared with acting on it. It is easy to miss someone privately. It is harder to apologize. It is easy to imagine a reunion. It is harder to rebuild trust. It is easy to say you care. It is harder to prove it consistently. If your soulmate truly wants to come closer, they will eventually have to cross that distance with actions, and you do not have to do all the work for them. Let them show you, let them speak, let them explain, let them demonstrate, and while you wait for nothing, continue becoming the person you are meant to become. Perhaps this is why the message says to watch before nightfall, not as a literal prediction that something supernatural must happen before a particular hour, but as a dramatic reminder to pay attention to the emotional shifts happening around you and within you. Nightfall can symbolize transition, one day ending, another beginning, the old chapter closing, a new chapter opening. Maybe before the day ends, you will realize something about yourself. Maybe you will stop waiting for an answer that someone else has to give. Maybe you will decide that you deserve directness. Maybe you will recognize that your heart can hold love without losing its independence. Maybe you will understand that your soulmate's journey is theirs. Your journey is yours, and if the two paths are meant